There's no business like none of your business. So here's the thing. Once you have acquired enough bases for every possible occasion and application, what do you do with your old 4-string workhorse? It's not as mighty and versatile as your fan fret 5-string. It's not as smooth and buttery as your fretless. It's not even small and portable like your headless, which, for all it lacks in size, still features a drop tuner on the E string. So for every time you could use your old 4-string, you've got another instrument much better suited to that specific job. But it's still the instrument that carried you through years and years of having fun making music, so you wouldn't sell it for the world. So how can you beef up that old axe of yours to give it back the attention that it deserves? Well, bigger is better, so I think I'll just double the number of strings then. No, not that kind of 8-string, gentlemen. I'm talking old school, and that means doubling up each existing string with a thinner string playing the octave above it. Fortunately, the manufacturer of my bass not only produces 8 strings, but also sells the required hardware separately. And even better, I hardly had to make any modifications to my instrument to make the parts fit. The only remaining problem was squeezing 4 additional machine heads into a headstock that was never designed for this kind of load. Then again, should I succeed, I wouldn't have one of those unspeakable abominations that usually grace the end of an 8-string neck. So when looking for tuning machines with minimal footprint, I came across gearless tuners. And since riot tuners seem to have occasional problems with string breakage, I chose to opt for Steinberger instead. Spoiler alert, they are made for guitar strings, so they really struggle with the kinds of forces I'm asking them to pull here. They are working fine for me so far, but be sure to observe the few caveats I give for this at the end of the video. So let's take off these old strings. They must have been on the instrument for ages, and we're gonna change them for new ones anyway. And the old nut. And the truss rod cover. And can we just take a second to appreciate the brilliant simplicity of this adjustable nut design, with single string adjustments no less. So take me to the bridge. I guess I could just plop the new bridge into the old base plate, but I've learned how shortcuts have a way of biting you in the butt further down the road, and we'll have plenty of those later in the video. So let's do a proper replacement here. The replacement of the tailpiece is however non-optional, so let's take it out. So with the old mounting plate clocking in at 33 2/3 versus the new one with 34.5 millimeters, we're in for some grinding. And just to make sure we didn't get the measurements wrong, the fitting test confirms that this is too tight and it won't go in all the way. So let's break out the drill and go full dentist on this cavity. And remember the screw-ups I mentioned earlier? Yeah, this is the first. But now that we have a good fit with a little room to spare, let's screw it in. And since the number and size of the screws holding the tailpiece has changed in the last 30 years, we'll have to drill a few new holes. So let's mark the drill positions, punch the markings so that the drill doesn't slip, and go to town. I do apologize for the crappy resolution in this bit, but I didn't realize that my camera app didn't switch the lens, but instead just applied a digital zoom. Doesn't go on the screw-up list though, because the bass is fine. Because wouldn't you know it, I've got the holes exactly where I want them, and the tailpiece has a nice tight fit. And when we put the bass strings back in, we find that the saddles for the thick strings are on the wrong side in the new bridge, so that thin and thick strings would have to cross each other. But if we simply turn around the bridge the way it came out of the box, we end up with the intonation screws on the pickup side, where they are far more difficult to access, We get much closer to the axis of the screw with the driver if we put the heads on the tailpiece side. And only after removing each of the 8 individual saddles and turning them around did I notice that they are not designed symmetrically. They have a smaller diameter hole for the threads of the screw on the one side and a larger diameter hole for the spring to sink into on the other. If you ignore this compression space for the springs, the overall intonation range of the instrument will be severely reduced. And that is not an option. So it's 1 step forward, 2 steps back. I'll spare you the sight of me retracing my steps to the original configuration, so instead have a look at what I should have done 2 steps ago, changing places of each pair of mini saddles with their neighbor and turning them around, so that at long last we arrive at something like this. And before we can drill the 4 holes for the new tuners, let's take out the old ones so that we have a clean headstock to work with. So let's get the Steinbergers out of their box. See that pin? That's not just to keep the tuner from rotating inside the drill hole. We'll come back to it later in the next screw up. In the meantime, let's just put the old hardware and strings back on, because in order to make any meaningful decision about the positioning of the new tuners on the headstock, we need the full picture in order to avoid collisions of hardware and strings. And be sure to verify what the spacing on the backside of the headstock looks like. This original position here would not have worked. Then punch the markings to keep the drill from slipping. Then let's remove the body, because we need to hold up the end of the neck for the tilted headstock to be completely level under the drill press. Then get out your best 10mm wood drill and set your drill press to the appropriate speed. Be careful to keep the headstock absolutely flat so that you don't ruin the drill hole. Looks good. That should work. These small pins keep the tuners from rotating, so we need to drill holes for those too. Mark them with a dab of paint and press them in. Can you guess the screw up here? If I had read the instructions manual, I would have noticed that the alignment of these pins is not random. They need to face the direction that the string is coming from, so that it can be threaded properly. So let's punch these markings and go to town. I'm working my way up through the diameters here to make absolutely sure I don't overshoot a tight fit. This fits nicely, until I drill it all over again in a different place, of course. Let's do a little bit of cleanup before we install the hardware then. Take the tuners apart, drop them in, and tighten those nuts. Then put the knob on and fix it with the set screws. And then we need to put back the old tuners as well, so that we arrive at something a little bit like this. And when we test fit the new nut, we find that it takes up slightly more space than the old one. This leads to the screw holes in the truss rod cover being 0.5 millimeter out of alignment. So let's shave off a tiny little bit of the truss rod cover. Again, be careful not to overshoot. Yep, that looks good. And this here is the bit where I realize that I need to do the alignment holes all over again. Editing me here. On second thought, why not just leave it like that? I'll face string slippage issues later, so stay tuned, I guess. Moving on then. Marking the new positions, drilling the new holes, with increasing diameters, putting everything back together again and adjusting the new nut. And now, finally putting in the new octave-up strings. Well, that's a bit thick. Wait, the ball end doesn't go in? Well, the flat ones I wanted to put on proved to be a bad choice in more than one way. But once we're there, let's adjust the tailpiece. So plop it back in, and joy oh joy, we can finally string this thing up. Apart from being too thick at the ball end, flat ones are also very difficult to find at this scale length, and I couldn't keep them from slipping through the locking nut. So I chose to go for dedicated 8-string sets, which are designed for this express purpose and should work fine. The round ones also sound brighter, which I hadn't really considered before. And after all, we're after those sweet, sweet overtones, aren't we? And while they worked fine first, they started slipping out of the locking tuners after a while as well. Pause the video if you want to guess why. It's the windings on the strings that seem to be the problem. They broke off and let the core string slip through. So let's get rid of those. You still have to bite down really hard with the locking screws, and I have no idea how long these tiny threads are going to take this kind of abuse. But at the moment, it works fine for me. And when I noticed that it was the tuner in the middle of the headstock giving me the most trouble, it suddenly struck me that the almost perfectly straight line that this string takes through the nut creates the least amount of friction along the way. So the nasty-looking angles on the other three actually seem to be an advantage in terms of tuning stability. Moving on. When checking the new nut, we find that the strings pull it out of alignment for almost a millimeter. So we have to find a way to keep it from sliding, but I don't want to fix it to the instrument permanently. So let's make 2 steel pins out of a hardened nail. And while I was sanding this nail for a perfect fit, I didn't account for the fact that the second drilling through this hole into the neck of the instrument would ruin that fit. So there's another thing I'll have to do all over again. And while you're watching me drill here, can you guess what's wrong with the positions of these holes? I didn't, so let's find out together later. So this is the pin, and that's where it goes in. And while I'm grinding it down for a flush surface, let's reflect on my choices and where I went wrong. I mean, this looks nice enough, doesn't it? Well, see this pin? And that screw? Yeah, they're exactly on top of each other. Ah well, nothing game-breaking so far. I just got my grubby little paws all over the golden brass hardware. But that's not gonna ruin the sound. I do apologize for the wonky playing. But plucking both strings simultaneously and equally takes a bit of getting used to. This is not only true for slapping, but for general string dampening as well. Like here. And if you want to make the most of the overtone growl, use a pick. Before I come to the conclusion, here's an afterthought. I really don't see why the strings shouldn't ever wrap around the central pole. I mean, there's plenty of space inside the tuner. And at first I thought pulling the string around a corner could help with the string slippage problem. Turns out the travel these guitar tuners have is barely enough for use on a bass, so you have to pull the strings really tight when locking them in, and that doesn't leave any space for fancy wrappings. And if everything fails later, I'll simply replace them with banjo tuners. Careful though, you'll need specialized high-ratio 10:1 tuners. Link in the description. The usual 4:1 planetary gear tuners don't cut the mustard. Just like the Steinbergers, the 10:1s are really pushed to their limit here, but they do work. So to conclude, it's doable, but depending on the brand and model of your bass, your mileage may vary. The cost didn't hurt me, but it was a hefty price tag. And you've seen how many problems I ran into, but they were all fixable, and the result is now absolutely unique. Nobody on this planet owns a bass exactly like this one, and I love the new sound and look. So I hope you learned something. I know I did. And if you consider yourself adequately entertained, feel free to leave a thumbs up or to leave your 50 cents in the comment section. And remember, if you got your grubby little paws all over your golden brass hardware, don't forget to wipe.